Autumn, 1942. The hills of eastern Tennessee lay draped in the quiet colors of October, amber and rust and deep woodland green, the ridges folding gently one behind the other the way they have for 10,000 years. Farmers here had worked the same valleys for generations. They knew the names of the creeks, the temperament of the soil, the particular way fog settled into the hollows before dawn. It was a modest, unhurried kind of country, isolated enough to be forgotten, quiet enough to keep a secret.
And then the government came. Within the span of a few months, approximately 1,000 families received notices that their land had been acquired by the United States Army. They were given weeks to gather what they could and leave. Most had never heard of the Manhattan Project. None of them were told why. They packed their belongings, looked back at the farms their grandparents had cleared, and drove away into a world that was changing faster than anyone fully understood.
What grew in the emptied valley of Black Oak Ridge would become one of the most remarkable and improbable places in American history, a city of 75,000 people that did not officially exist, a place that appeared on no maps, received no mail with a proper return address, and whose residents, scientists, engineers, laborers, secretaries, and teenagers fresh out of high school, were building the most powerful weapon in human history without most of them knowing it. This is the story of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the city behind the fence. The idea that would produce Oak Ridge had been forming in the minds of physicists for years before a single acre of Tennessee soil was disturbed. In the late 1930s, scientists in Europe had discovered that the nucleus of a uranium atom, when struck by a neutron, could split apart, a process they called fission. The energy released in that splitting was staggering, far beyond anything conventional chemistry could produce. The implications were difficult to speak aloud. In August 1939, Albert Einstein, by then living in exile in the United States, signed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. He had been persuaded to write it by fellow physicists who understood what the discovery meant and feared, with very good reason, that Germany was already working to harness it. The letter explained the physics carefully and plainly. A bomb of tremendous destructive force was theoretically possible. It might require a great deal of uranium. It might require years of work, but it was possible. Roosevelt read the letter. He was not a scientist, but he was a strategist. He created a committee to look into the matter.
The committee took time. The program took shape slowly, cautiously, the way large and uncertain things often do. But after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought America fully into the war, caution gave way to urgency. The Manhattan Project, its very name chosen to obscure its purpose, was formalized under the direction of the Army's Corps of Engineers in the summer of 1942. Its mission was to produce an atomic bomb before Germany did. Its budget would eventually reach $2 billion. Its workforce would number in the hundreds of thousands. And its most important production site would be carved out of a Tennessee valley that most Americans had never heard of. The Army chose the site carefully. It needed to be remote enough for secrecy, large enough for the sprawling industrial facilities that would be required, close enough to electrical power, and the Tennessee Valley Authority provided that in abundance. The valley between Black Oak Ridge and Walden Ridge fit every criterion. It was a pocket of the world tucked behind natural walls of forested hills. You could hide a city there if you tried, and that was exactly what they intended to do. Construction began in late 1942 with the organized efficiency the wartime army had learned to apply to enormous undertakings. Workers arrived by the thousands, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, laborers of every kind, drawn by the promise of steady wages and housing at a time when much of the country still felt the memory of the Depression in its bones. They built roads first, then utilities, then dormitories and cafeterias and homes, row upon row of prefabricated houses that went up with startling speed, rising from muddy Tennessee ground while the leaves were still on the trees.
The living conditions were, by the standards of wartime, decent. Workers were housed in one of several grades of accommodation, depending on their role. Flat-top houses for families, dormitories for single workers, trailers and hutments for the enormous laboring workforce at the bottom of the hierarchy. The mud was legendary. Residents would later recall that in the early days, the streets of Oak Ridge were rivers of clay after rain, that wooden boardwalks were the only reliable way to move from building to building, that boots were a more necessary accessory than almost anything else. The city was being built and inhabited simultaneously, an enterprise of tremendous improvised energy. But even as the houses went up and the cafeterias opened and schools began filling with children, the true purpose of Oak Ridge remained tightly, deliberately obscured. Workers were hired for specific tasks and told nothing beyond what their task required. Security was not a procedure, it was a culture, enforced by guards at every gate, by the badges everyone carried, by the constant, quiet reminder that questions were not to be asked and information was not to be shared. The fence was real. A perimeter of chain link and guard posts surrounded the entire reservation, 60,000 acres enclosed, and no one entered or left without showing identification. Visitors required approval. Mail was opened and read. Telephone calls were monitored. A resident who let slip too much to a relative in a letter might find a quiet visit from a security officer the following day. And yet, people lived there, fully, ordinarily, in the particular way that human beings adapt to whatever circumstances they find themselves in. There were movie theaters inside the fence, churches and recreation halls, a bowling alley, a library. Children rode bikes between the rows of identical houses and played in the yards and went to school in the morning without thinking over much about what their parents did for work. Teenagers held dances, couples married, babies were born. Ordinary life threaded itself through extraordinary secrecy without great difficulty, because most people, when they are comfortable and busy and surrounded by community, do not spend a great deal of time interrogating the larger shape of things. The work itself was divided across several enormous facilities, each one a marvel of wartime engineering, each one dedicated to a specific piece of a puzzle that almost no one held in its entirety. The largest of these was the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, a building so vast that it covered nearly 500,000 square feet, at the time the largest building under one roof in the world. Its purpose was to enrich uranium by separating the lighter uranium-235 isotope, the one capable of sustaining a chain reaction, from its heavier, far more abundant cousin, uranium-238. The process required uranium to be converted into a gas and then passed repeatedly through barriers of porous material, each stage producing a slightly more enriched product than the last. It required thousands of stages. It required extraordinary precision in the manufacture of components. And it required enormous amounts of electricity, supplied by the dams of the Tennessee Valley Authority running at full capacity.
There was also the WWII electromagnetic separation plant, which used a different method. Powerful magnets curving streams of uranium ions, the lighter isotope following a slightly tighter arc than the heavy, to accomplish the same separation. WWII consumed so much copper for its electromagnets that the government borrowed approximately 14,700 tons of silver from the United States Treasury to substitute for copper that was needed elsewhere in the war effort. Silver, handled and processed in a classified installation in Tennessee as a matter of wartime pragmatism.
And there was the X-10 graphite reactor, more modest in scale, but historically significant beyond measure. It was the world's first continuously operating nuclear reactor. It produced small quantities of plutonium, the artificial element that physicists had recently discovered could also sustain a fission chain reaction. X-10 was a pilot plant, a proof of concept, feeding knowledge to the far larger reactors being built in secret along the Columbia River and Washington State.
The workers who operated these plants, the shift workers who monitored gauges and replaced components and drove small vehicles through the immense floors of K-25, knew they were doing something important. They knew it involved uranium in the broadest sense. They knew the work was classified, but the full shape of it, the destination toward which all their careful labor was pointed, remained beyond the horizon of their understanding. A young woman named Ruth Huddleston, who came to Oak Ridge from rural Virginia in 1943, would later recall that she and her colleagues on the Y-12 floor were told only this, that the meters they watched needed to stay within a certain range, that they should report any deviation, and that what they were doing was helping to end the war. That was enough. It was wartime. Helping to end the war was a purpose so clear and large that it required no further explanation. Thousands of young women like Ruth Huddleston staffed the instruments of Oak Ridge. They were called cubicle operators, and they sat in long rows before panels of gauges, watching, adjusting, reporting. They had been chosen in part for a quality their supervisors had observed in previous testing. They followed instructions carefully and did not let curiosity interfere with attention. Whether the managers who made that observation intended it charitably is a matter of interpretation. What is certain is that these women were essential. The machines could not run without them.
The city grew through 1943 and into 1944, with a speed that even its inhabitants found slightly surreal. Population doubled, then doubled again. The Tennessee hills that had been quiet farming country 2 years before now held a city larger than Knoxville, connected to the outside world only through guarded gates and official channels.
Scientific talent had been recruited from across the country and, in many cases, from across the Atlantic. Physicists who had fled Europe in the 1930s, men and women who had left everything behind to escape the rise of fascism, now found themselves in a Tennessee valley, contributing their knowledge and their urgency to a project that might determine whether the world they had escaped would ever fully recede. They worked alongside American scientists from Chicago, from Berkeley, from Columbia and Princeton and MIT. The intellectual density of Oak Ridge during the war years was extraordinary. Ordinary conversations in the cafeteria might involve questions of nuclear physics that had never been asked aloud before anywhere in the world. The pace of discovery was relentless because the pace of the war allowed nothing slower. Security remained a constant presence throughout. The Army's Counterintelligence Corps maintained a quiet watch over the population of Oak Ridge, monitoring for signs of espionage, of loose talk, of ideological sympathy with the enemy. Posters on the walls of the plants reminded workers that a careless word could cost lives. The most famous of these depicted a stylized ear listening over a worker's shoulder beneath the words, "Someone is always listening." The precautions were not entirely without cause. The Soviet Union had placed agents in proximity to the Manhattan Project at several locations. Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant German-born physicist who worked on the theoretical side of bomb design, was transmitting information to Soviet intelligence throughout the war, a fact that would not be discovered until 1950. The fear of espionage was real, even if its specific manifestations at Oak Ridge were, for the most part, unfounded.
But for most residents of the city behind the fence, security was simply a fact of life, an inconvenience managed and mostly forgotten, the way people forget about traffic lights once driving becomes routine. They had their lives, their friendships and their work and their particular satisfactions. There was a community tennis league and debates in the cafeteria about which shift had the best food, and church choirs that practiced in the recreation hall on Thursday evenings. The city functioned because people lived in it, and people adapt to the conditions of wherever they happen to be with remarkable grace. Letters home were censored, but letters still went. Residents were not supposed to say where they were working, but a postmark from Knoxville and the unusual absence of any specific address told a particular story to careful readers. Some families knew, in a general way, that something significant was happening in eastern Tennessee. They knew better than to press for details. A woman who worked in the administration offices of Oak Ridge wrote to her mother in North Carolina every Sunday afternoon, describing the weather, the cafeteria food, the church service she had attended, the small pleasures and frustrations of daily life, and never once mentioning uranium or enrichment or the name of any facility where she worked. Her mother wrote back faithfully. The correspondence continued for the duration of the war. When it was over and the secret was finally told, her mother said she had suspected something, but she had trusted that her daughter was all right, and that had been enough. By the summer of 1945, the enriched uranium produced at Oak Ridge had been assembled at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico into a device that its designers called Little Boy. It was not a beautiful thing by any ordinary definition. It was a cylinder of machined metal containing a carefully calculated quantity of uranium-235, material that had been separated atom by atom through thousands of stages of gaseous diffusion and electromagnetic separation in those enormous Tennessee plants.
On August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped from a B-29 aircraft called the Enola Gay over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the history of human warfare. The city was destroyed. Tens of thousands of people died in the first moments, and tens of thousands more in the weeks and months that followed from burns and radiation sickness. 3 days later, a second bomb, built from plutonium produced at the Washington State reactors that X-10 had helped to design, fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war was over. The people of Oak Ridge learned what they had been building in the same way the rest of the world did, through the radio, through newspaper headlines, through the particular stunned silence that follows news that exceeds the imagination. Many of them sat in the cafeterias and recreation halls where they had spent the better part of 3 years and tried to understand what it meant. They had known their work was important. They had been told it would help end the war. Now they knew exactly how. The reactions were complex and various, as human reactions to enormous things always are. There was pride. There was relief that the war had ended, that the invasion of Japan, projected to cost hundreds of thousands of lives, would not occur. There was sorrow. There was the particular disorientation of learning, all at once, the full shape of something you had been a part of without fully knowing. Some of the scientists who had worked on the theoretical side of the project had understood, in the abstract, what they were building. Some had argued, in private memos and petitions, that the bomb should be demonstrated rather than deployed against a city. But the decision had not been theirs to make, and now history had been made, and they were inside it. Ruth Huddleston, the young woman from Virginia who had watched her meters and trusted that she was helping to end the war, said later that she had felt, on the day the news came, something she could not quite name. Relief, yes, but also a kind of weight. She had done her part. The part had mattered enormously. She was glad the war was over. She held all of these things at once, the way people do when they have lived through something that language struggles to hold.
The years after the war brought gradual change to the city behind the fence. The gates were opened in 1949. Residents could finally come and go without showing a badge. Street addresses were assigned. Oak Ridge appeared on maps for the first time. It was incorporated as a city in 1959. The workers who had come for the duration stayed, in many cases, for lifetimes. They built houses and raised children, and watched the Tennessee seasons move through the familiar hills that had, by now, become home. The plants continued to operate, in changed forms and for different purposes, throughout the Cold War and beyond. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory became one of the leading scientific research institutions in the world, investigating problems in energy, material science, biology, and nuclear technology. The city that had been born in wartime secrecy became a permanent piece of the American scientific landscape.
Today, the American Museum of Science and Energy in Oak Ridge tells the story of what happened in this valley between 1942 and 1945. Visitors can stand in front of photographs of the calutrons, the enormous electromagnetic separators of Y12. They can read the words of the workers. They can look at the maps that weren't supposed to exist. There is a particular quietness to the story of Oak Ridge that sets it apart from many wartime histories. Its drama was not the drama of the battlefield, no gunfire, no particular moment of physical courage. Its drama was the drama of collective purpose, sustained over years by thousands of people who trusted that what they were doing mattered, and who did their work carefully and well, in the absence of full understanding. Scientists and shift workers and cafeteria staff and school teachers and security guards and the children who rode their bikes through the muddy streets, all of them together, inside the fence of the city that wasn't there.
The secret they kept was one of the largest ever kept in peacetime or war. That it held, for the years it needed to hold, says something about the particular discipline of wartime and about the ordinary human capacity to inhabit a mystery with patience and good faith.
Outside the fence, in the hills that had always been there, the seasons moved in their unhurried way. October came around again, year after year, laying its amber and rust across the ridges, just as it had when the valley was nothing but farms and creeks, and the particular stillness of a place that most of the world had never heard of. The people who had been displaced to make room for Oak Ridge, the farm families who received their leases and drove away, eventually found other ground, other rhythms. What had been taken from them could not be given back, but the valley held their names still, in the old deed records and the memories of their descendants, a palimpsest of all that had been there before the fence went up and the city appeared from nothing.
History moves through places like water through stone, slowly and with great patience, leaving its marks long after the moving has stopped. The hills of eastern Tennessee absorbed the weight of what happened there, and kept growing their forests and their wildflowers and their seasons, as they had always done. And somewhere in those hills, in the quiet that falls over the valley after the last light has gone, there is still something of the stillness that was there before the trucks came and the workers and the hum of the great machines, before the city rose behind its fence and the world changed in ways that no one living then could fully see. A good thing sometimes to sit quietly with a history like this one, to hold it gently, without the need to resolve it or contain it, to let it settle into the deeper places where large things find their rest. The city that didn't exist built the thing that ended the war, and the people who built it went on with their lives, carrying their particular pieces of a story too large for any one person to hold alone. That is how history often works, quietly, in the dark, in places no one was supposed to know about. And it is enough tonight simply to know that it happened, that ordinary people did extraordinary things, and that somewhere in eastern Tennessee, the hills are still standing, holding everything the way they always have. Rest now. The story is done.